Good afternoon and welcome to the virtual edition of an author's afternoon in Kolkata. With the monsoon having set in the backdrop, the time is just right for a session of words and wordsmith. And having a very own Kolkata girl, Nilanjana Roy, as the guest author just makes it perfect. An author's afternoon is a space designed by Prabha Khaitan Foundation where English authors get to engage in an informal interaction with their aficionados on their craft and life. The foundation weaves together multifarious activities orbiting around literature and performing arts that go to initiate various women empowerment programs and significant social causes. The new normal has led us to reconstruct our sessions and go virtual so that our patrons are not deprived of their passion for literature and keep the morals and spirits flying high while abiding by the health norms. Nilanjana is an alumni of La Martiniere for Girls and holds a degree in literature from St. Stephen's College, Delhi. Her writing career spans over 15 prolific years, including writing columns, journals, reporting, journalism, travel writing, and spent several happy years as an intrepid blogger, Huri Babu, over the now defunct Kitabkhana. She's helped to set up the Indian publishing house Westland Books as its first chief editor, is a founding member of Pen Delhi. Nilanjana is the author of 2 award-winning fantasy novels, The Wildlings and The 100 Names of Darkness, a collection of essays on reading, The Girl Who Ate Books. Black River, her third novel and her first for an adult audience, is all set to captivate readers. In conversation with Nilanjana is our very own SAS woman of Kolkata, Malika Verma, entrepreneur, designer, and social worker. I welcome both of you.
Thank you so much. It is really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here with the Prabha Khaitan Foundation. And I am such an admirer of everything that you do. Really looking forward to talking to Malika this afternoon.
Thank you, Nilisha, and welcome everybody. It's really lovely to have you with us, Nilanjana, and it's been a lovely few days chatting with you and catching up. Born in Kolkata, educated in La Martiniere, graduated from St. Stephen's. You've achieved a lot in a few years. So tell us, just to begin with, about your few years in Kolkata, and did you always want to be a journalist, a writer, or was this something that happened later?
Well, I was born in Calcutta in Bellevue Hospital. My grandmother lived there for many years in a part of Baliganj in one of those old red brick houses with green shuttered windows that you don't see much of these days. And so our connection started from the time that we were very, very young. We would come down for holidays. And I was fortunate enough to spend 4 years here at the end of the 1980s. And Calcutta was a rocking city at that point. It was beginning to crumble a little bit. What I remember about it was that it was not just a Bengali city. It was also a Marwari city. It was a Gujarati city even back then. And you had the Armenians, the Parsis, the Anglo-Indians. And looking back, I realized that I grew up not only lucky enough to have wonderful teachers at La Martiniere who got me into books and writing, but I grew up with the cosmopolitanism of Calcutta and the lack of hierarchy that we took for granted. We assumed that it was part of the Indian firmament. I must confess, I more or less blundered into journalism. I was heading straight for the PhD track, and I was going to do a slightly alarming degree in literary theory and criticism and subaltern studies. And then I veered off track when I was doing my MA in Delhi and JNU. I discovered I used to write for a publication called The Book Review when I started when I was 15 years old. I'm sorry. I started by reviewing children's books. And it had never occurred to me that that might be a career. But I wrote one piece for the Business Standard, and it just sounded so exciting. Thought that you could spend some of your life going out, meeting people, hearing their stories, and people from artists to politicians to social workers. There was quite a spectrum. And so I veered sideways, never did the PhD, and began as an arts and books reporter for the Business Standard. Went on to cover gender and politics for a little while for the New York Times, and then took a little time off the last few years to write the next book. I still do a column for the Financial Times as a books columnist, because if there's one common thread in my life, it's the love of books. It's something that Calcutta infected me with, actually. And I think those of us who are Kolkatans carry that virus around with us wherever we go.
So happy to know that. Happy to know that you bring in Kolkata, a little bit of it wherever you go. Before you became a full-time novelist, I think you've been a food columnist, a travel writer, a reporter, a columnist on gender violence. I've had to write it down. An editor, a publisher, a legal researcher. You've taught briefly in a nursery school and intrepid blogger. You wrote India's first literary blog, Kitab Khana, and you used to blog as Hari Babu. So this is really interesting. Tell us about it, and it was very special to you. So what made it so special?
I have to confess that CV is a red warning light. It basically says, cannot stick to anything, is doomed to be a novelist. But Kitab Khana, I look back at that with such happiness. It was a time when you didn't have this monster internet, with Twitter filled with celebrities and run by Google, Facebook, all the big corporations. You had a very do-it-yourself internet, where by and large the blog scene, that blogs were a little like a non-image version of Instagram, where you shared your thoughts and you shared your passions. And there were a bunch of us around the world who were in a lonely way sending out these little signal flares, So there was Maud Newton, who blogged from America, Laila Lalami, who wrote as the Moorish Girl and later on became a novelist herself, Sarah Weinman, who used to blog about crime books. And there were bloggers from Baghdad. There's one who ended up being thrown in prison, Hussein Derakshan, and then released years later, and he came back to find that blogs had died in the time that he was in prison, and he didn't know about it. But I picked Hari Babu as a way of kind of pushing back a little bit at Kipling, and immediately discovered that I was like, okay, fine, if you're going to be Rudyard Kipling about all of us Indians, and we can take over your character and, tell you what we think of the British literary scene. But I found it a fascinating experience, actually. You're treated very differently on the internet, even in that generation, if people see you as a man rather than a woman. That's just an aside. What I loved about blogging, honestly, is it was just a way for us to talk about books, translations. A lot of us who write in English now, from J.R. Arjun Singh to Chandrahas Chaudhary, we were also discovering our own languages at the time. So while technically we were put into this field of English writing, I had just started to read Bengali literary journals as a way of trying to keep a little bit of the language with me, no matter where I went, no matter whether I was in Delhi or Goa or traveling elsewhere. And because I lived in Delhi for so long, I was beginning to discover the delights of Hindi literature. And, when you're growing up, I think you almost are pushed away from your normal Indian languages because you're taught them harshly in school or something of the sort. And over time, I think I've grown to love having all three of them side by side, English, Hindi, Bengali. Hindi and Bengali seep into my English, and I think I'm luckier for that. I've gone off track a bit, but feel free to corral me back.
No, just speak whatever you want. I'm just trying to prompt you so I can get whatever I can out of you. But coming to your blogging and coming to a statement that you have said that each generation discovers reading in a different manner. Do you feel, a lot of us feel that the new generation is not reading as much. On the other hand, they have something called a Kindle. So the books are sort of going a little out of fashion, maybe. how do you read, and what is still special to you about your reading, writing, books, and what would you like to say to the younger generation?
That is such a beautiful question, and it's something that I'm absolutely passionate about. What I find is that every generation assumes that books are dying. In the 18th century, they were moaning about the fact that the novel had killed literature. And now we're moaning that the novel is dead. And we've always said that the younger generation doesn't read. The younger generation does read, but they don't read in a way that we are necessarily familiar with in our 40s and 50s. They're a very text-friendly generation. In a sense, you might want to think of people in their teenage years and their 20s as people who have grown up surrounded by text on their screens. They use text to talk to each other, and they're looking for stories that are not necessarily small, but that make sense to them. So they might not read the classics, but they might read that entire sprawling world of what's called fan fiction or slash fiction, which is filled with zombies and rakshases and this, that, and the other, and where the lure of that is that you can take a beloved author's work and you can make it your own. And I think J.K. Rowling, of course, is in the middle of a huge controversy now. But way back when she came up with the Harry Potter books, that response enough, the fact that she was so loved by generation after generation, should have demonstrated to us that there's an appetite for books. I turn it around and actually say, what are we doing to make sure that the young read? Every city in India has so few bookstores. We have so few libraries. And we don't, market books the way that we market a pizza. It's not sitting there in the malls, easily accessible. And we've got to find a way to make that more part of their lives. I think in a way, Netflix and Hulu are doing a lot inadvertently because they're turning books into serials and into films and bringing that back. And you will see kids doing that. I never underestimate the intelligence of people at 14, 15. I remember what we were like then, and we thought we were grown up, My own reading, I was lucky to grow up in a house that was almost literally built of books in Calcutta. There were bookcases everywhere. And my grandmother used to leave them around, along next to the biscuit tin, which is a really smart move because you reach for a biscuit and you reach for a book. But I've been a lifelong reader to the point where, of course, I read for work. I read about 6 to 12 books a week minimally to keep in touch with what I need to for my column. And that's not so much. If you think about it, lawyers read a lot in terms of their briefs and all of that. But more than anything else, I find that I read differently with every 5 years or so. Sometimes I go back to the epics because you feel like you're reading too much in your own century and you feel the need to see what humans before have said. Sometimes I just spend 6 months trying to read as much as I can in Hindi and Sanskrit because I don't know that world fully. And sometimes I'm reading trash, pulp, for absolute pleasure. The trashier the romance, the more the zombie count, the more the body count, give that to me.
Wow.
And it's fine. I can't imagine a world without books. I can't imagine my world or my imagination without books. I don't know who I would be. I was built of them in some ways. And that, to some extent, is what all readers feel, right?
Yeah, I'm sure. And I also feel that you've won the hearts of the next generation totally by understanding and appreciating their little twist or their new way of reading. There's so much that we need to connect with them to see and understand what they do. I'm going to move on because there's a lot that I have on my little agenda with you. Of course, before we come to the award-winning fantasy novels of Wildings and the 100 Names of Darkness, your collection of essays, The Girl Who Ate Books, in one of the reviews was, it is written in the author's understated but failingly elegant style. This is an essential collection for those who live to read and read to live. Beautifully written and described. So tell us a little about it.
Well, that was so kind. I think the reviews have been very, very generous. But this is the book that we're talking about, The Girl Who Ate Books. And it was a collection. It started off
a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It started off as a collection of my book columns that I used to write those for the Business Standard for about 10 years or so. And I loved writing both that column and the Financial Times column because your readers are really amazing. They tend to stay in touch with you sometimes for years. I still have one of the Business Standard friends I made has been in touch with me for about 20 years or so. Instead of explaining what this is, because what I did was I took the columns and turned them into two kinds of histories. One was I just felt the need to write a little casual, non-academic, non-scholarly history of what Indian writing in English was. We tend to think of it as very recent, and we assume that it started with Salman Rushdie or with Vikram Seth or Arundhati Roy. And the truth is that it goes back to the freedom struggle. One of the earliest near novels written in this was by Shashi Chandra Dutt, whom you might know as the brother of the more famous poet Torul Dutt. And Shashi Chandra Dutt wrote a lovely little piece called The Republic of Orissa. He was writing in 1845, and he imagined an India that was free of the British because of a tribal rebellion that would chase them out of the country, or at least out of Orissa, by 1916. And it was remarkable. It was only many years later that I went back and I realized that the freedom struggle actually began before the Great War of 1857 with the tribal rebellions around the country. They were the first nationalists, if you want to call it that way. And all of that history is there in the history of Indian writing in English because we collided so hard with the Brits. But may I read you a short section about Calcutta again, if that's all right?
Would love you to. Thank you.
This is just a little section that might explain where my love for the city comes from. I try to avoid nostalgia, but sometimes, nostalgia is also based on something that's really genuine and heartfelt. And please excuse any false notes of yearning that come across in this. On long road trips, I often dream of Kolkata, especially in the mountains where the air is thin enough to switch on the mind's most vivid hallucinations. It is always the same dream. I'm a child, young enough to be carried past the whitewashed walls where graffiti and political slogans ran from one end of a street to another. My eyes are level with the spiky, palm frond tops of the Bengali letters. Sometimes I'm in a car, looking out, but the feeling remains the same of traveling through a city built in sentences and slogans where rivers of words flowed through its lanes. Each neighborhood's walls were allocated to political parties. The Paratchede were the gangs of boys who ran each patch of territory. They lounged on the street corners, lighting their cigarettes from the end of a burning twist of rope as the rains came down. As the muggy summer heat rose up from the cramped pavements, they saw to it that few walls were left pristine white or cream. The calligraphy of the graffiti artists was superb, sometimes as beautiful as the brushstroke Bengali words that adorn posters and book covers. The hammer and the sickle, the political symbol of the communist left parties, is the first punctuation mark I remember. Also the bearded trio of Marx, Lenin, and fading into historical distance, Stalin. Sometimes the fragile framework of the Howrah Bridge, sketched in black and green paint, sounded a more wistful note. In my dreams, the walls and their words are alive, and the black slashes and rounded stomachs of the Bengali letters undulate, pushing and shoving past me like crowds shouting worn and familiar slogans. Amader dabi mante hobe, cholbe na, cholbe na. Our demands must be heard. This won't do, this won't do. Later, as a student in the city, I grew used to the walls and I took their chatter for granted. They were as verbal as the rest of Kolkata. You walked and you drove among colorful and carefully calligraphed slogans, Bengali advertisements, as though the pages of magazines and flapping banners had been frozen in stone and brick, as if the city itself was a large, living, illustrated book. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Really made this very special. Um, Talking about when you were a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, you were always very liberal in your speech and your opinions, like you have been in this book as well. You spoke on gender issues, racism, free speech, the death row, the government, democracy. Where do you think, what is the future of the Republic now, and where are we headed?
I think we've spent so many years being terrified that the Republic is tilting over. And that is a wise view to take because we are a very young democracy. It is a very, very recent time in terms of history that we have made the agreement to be a nation. And that we made this agreement also to be a nation that respected one another's religions and ways of life, that said that we must be free. And we always remember liberty and equality. And as Mukul Kesavan pointed out, we tend to forget that the Constitution was also built on the promise of fraternity. I don't think I could help being a liberal. It's not just that, like many of us, I come from a family where we revered the freedom struggle. We were taught to know what it was about. We were taught to know about the centuries and the decades that went into fighting for Indian independence. But I think while I'm a very quiet and soft-spoken person, my internal compass is set fiercely towards independence, and whatever difficulties I went through in my life may have made me more sensitive to injustice in a wider sense. I think I was always aware that I came from a very privileged background. But as my gender work took me around parts of Haryana and UP and the rest of the country, and I learned to just sit back and listen. You walk into a story about surrogate mothers, for example, with maybe your mind made up that they are selling their wombs for money. And then one of them will turn around and they'll say, but our marriages are arranged. You don't think that is the kind of slavery? We have no choice in the matter. At least here I choose. And suddenly your entire worldview shifts. I don't think you can be a citizen of a democracy without having a relationship with it. And that relationship is as close and personal as a family relationship. Away from the noise of, oh, I love my country, and this kind of false national pride that is expressed only in shouting and slogans and fists raised and trying to tell other people how to love their country. Our relationships with our country, as Tagore pointed out, they're personal and they're deep and they're loving. At this point of time, I do think that we face a terrible choice, and the terrible choice is not necessarily the right versus the left. It's not just that the right is in power and Hindutva is an aggressive, if you like, religious majoritarianism philosophy. I'm so sorry, Malika, we have a cat on the table, but she is leaving. So Malika did the amazing thing of reading my cat books while being slightly concerned about cats. She has a slight phobia of cats, and I respect that entirely. Jenny, just sorry. Here we were with the democracy, and there we are with the cat trying to Zoom bomb from the back. She's not been successful. So the Republic is secure for one more day. What I see as actually a terrible moment of crisis for us is that every one of the institutions on which we base a healthy democracy is in trouble. And that hasn't happened even during the emergency. We haven't had a time when we are worried that the judiciary is not independent. Half the media is not just sold, which is an ordinary thing in most democracies. You expect the media not to be that independent and to support the ruling party up to a certain point. That in itself is terrible, but it is also toxic. It is, a lot of the media is deliberately pushing not just propaganda, but a dangerous wave of hate. It is now directed against Muslims, and you never know who's going to be the next victim. Sometimes it's directed against anybody who questions the government. And what I see is that when the institutions of democracy start to crack, then it is time to sound the alarm. And when people are afraid to speak their minds, often you turn around and you say, oh, that's only writers, that's only the creative class. But what I see is that businessmen are also afraid to speak their minds, and that among the political class, people are careful. They watch what they say. That's not the free country that we want. And I think it is going to take time and conscious effort to actually sit back and say, this is not a battle of the right versus the left. In a way, it's a time that many people, from S. Radhakrishnan to Tagore to B.R. Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar, had warned us against. It said, as a republic, you will be tested over and over again. What kind of country do you want to be? And who is this country supposed to be for? If it's supposed to be all of us united together, we the people, then I think we have to reclaim that. And I think we will have to reclaim that not just in this decade, urgently, but in the decades to come. I think that struggle is part of being a citizen. We can never take it for granted.
So I did want to talk a little bit about the gender issues, but I'm going to go into the books first because we're all waiting to hear about, and we'll come back if we have time to the gender issues. Your award-winning novels, Salman Rushdie has said, Nilanjana's novel is a delight to read. Eliot's Old Possum would have enjoyed these practical Indian cats. The environmental fable about a clan of cats in the rapidly changing old Delhi neighborhood of Nizamuddin. It does have guest appearances of a warrior mongoose, black kites, and a dog, thank God. But these books are political allegories. And, tell us, since I wasn't able to go through all the books, tell us about these two very, very, famous books, and why Delhi, why cats? Tell us more about them.
I think it is so brave of you. We laugh about the cat phobia, but actually it's something that you can't help, and it's very brave of you to go through cat books when you have that fear with you. And can I reassure you by saying that the dog is a lovely dog.
Okay.
His name is Doginder Singh, and he is a G.O.D. He's the god of the dhaba, the god of the dhaba. But I wrote The Wildings. I think a lot of people were surprised that I didn't come out with the 3-generation saga about Bengali women, living through 18th century and 19th century Calcutta, which is somewhere there in the back of my mind. I wrote it because I was beginning to discover that my love-hate relationship with Delhi, which has continued for the 25 almost years that my husband and I have lived here, was inexplicably tending more towards love than hate. And, Delhi has a horrible climate. It is either dusty, or it is sweaty, or it is hot, or it is unbearable. It refuses to have a proper monsoon, and I'm a Calcutta girl, I'm used to a proper monsoon. It is aggressive and in your face, and it is also a melting pot, and it also has that vast history behind it, and it also has a kind of kindness. And I didn't know how to write about that, so I love cats, and that love came to me late in life, and I started to see the city through the eyes of the cats and the strays, and then realized that actually, if you look at a city from that lens, at a time when it was already beginning to crack up, it was already beginning to become more concrete and less kikar forest. At this point, the Aravalli Hills are being sold off. And this is something that's familiar. In Calcutta, what you're dealing with is a lot of your old buildings being knocked down. You could lose them within 10 to 15 years. And you're looking at your wetlands being filled in without too many people being aware of how dangerous that is for the city. In Goa, where I lived for a little while, there was a great fear among the villagers that their way of life would be knocked aside by mining on one hand and by the overbuilding on the other. I didn't want to preach at people, but when I started to see it from the point of view of animals, I realized that it was a survivor's story. I was very lucky, actually, that it was nominated for something like, I've forgotten, 6 or 7 awards, and it won one, much to my shock and surprise. I was very glad that it did, simply because it's rare in India for a children's book to be taken seriously. And I think it was taken seriously because my usual preoccupations with freedom came through in the protagonist's life. And she's a little street cat called Mara, who was found in a drain pipe, taken into the house of the Big Feet. We are the Big Feet, you know. And she spends a lot of her life fearful of the outside, when slowly overcoming that fear in order to make friends with respectively a tiger and then some other cats and then a monkey, and so it goes, you know. I'll leave you to discover the wildings on your own if you want to. They were the very first books I wrote as novels, and so they were imperfect. But for me, they actually broke through a fear of my own. I think I was comfortable by then being a journalist, and I'd enjoyed really writing for the Business Standard simply because they had superb editors. And I loved writing for the New York Times as I do for the Financial Times, because it brings you into a wider global world, but a world that is also deeply interested in everything around it. It's not just America or UK centric. But the Wildings was for me. You know, the Wildings was my way to come through my fear of saying, I actually secretly want to write fiction. And I don't necessarily want that to be useful fiction. I just want to write stories that I love writing and that I hope people love reading. For me, no disrespect to the awards, because I know how hard juries work on those. But what mattered to me about the Wildings is that even now, I have children and sometimes adults writing in from all around the world, and they will always, always share pictures of their cats or their dogs or their cockatoos or something of the sort. And once in a while, they will write something that breaks my heart, and you know, somebody will say, I was so afraid of this, but now I identify of Mara and I have managed to do X. And I'm like, yes, all right, I was some use in this universe.
I would like to know about what you're currently working upon. What book are you writing about? I also do want to ask you about your thoughts on gender equality, and in the cities that you have lived, which of the cities do you think is really which is your favorite? I hope it's Calcutta, but if it's not, we'll deal with that. But which one? Where did you get most inspired? Which was your favorite place? Where did you? I think in India there we have this thing called an apparent gender equality, where a lot of the women do think they are equal, but it's not the truth. So have you felt that? Where would you think is the most liberal place you've lived in?
That's a wonderful question, actually, and it covers a lot of ground. So let me break it into parts. In terms of cities, I have a poly-city amorous heart. Yeah.
Wow.
What I mean by that is that Calcutta shaped me in ways that I'm still so grateful for. It was an easy city to walk around. And in Delhi, the one thing I miss most, even now, is I do walk around the city, but there's an element of fear for any woman on the streets. I thought it would change the moment I hit 40. I was so excited about that year. And here I am at many years older, the 50s coming up, and it is still not safe. You know, I think a lot of people who live in Calcutta, though, will point out that it is not necessarily a completely safe city. It is not necessarily paradise. But what it does have and has historically had is generations of women who are outspoken and who own themselves in a way that sometimes women in the North don't. You know, to this I'm expanding Delhi and putting in UP and Haryana as well. And I'm saying that a lot of the women I've met in my travels are very independent, but they see themselves as part of the family, as representatives of the community or their religion or something larger. And in Calcutta, in some way, I think across class, a lot of women see themselves as very independent. They see themselves as entitled to take part in politics, you know, and not just the fact that you have a woman chief minister in Bengal, but you have political engagement at every level. at that, I don't think Calcutta or any place is really as equal as it thinks it is. Even in our relatively privileged circumstances, we were discussing this yesterday and saying how the lockdown had actually opened up a real can of worms, because women are still expected to be in charge. We expected to be perfect in the workplace and manage work from home, and we expected to manage the home as well. And even when husbands help, mine, thankfully, is well trained by his feminist mother. So I was very lucky that way. But husbands get a lot more credit for doing the things that women do anyway, you know. We're moving from side to side. I will say that Goa was actually it had a lot of patriarchal men, but it was also very equal because women there have been used to owning property for years thanks to the Portuguese Codex. The places, though, I don't want to diss my country at all, but I will say that I've felt freest sometimes in the Northeast, where women have a lot of agency. You know, you're looking not just at how equal women are, but at how much agency they have. And you know, Manika, we take a lot of the gains of feminism for granted. A lot of women assume that feminism is done and dusted and there are no more battles to fight. And I want to tell them, wait a minute, you know, 100 years ago, most women around the world didn't have a vote. And 150 years ago, about 200 years ago, my own ancestors, and I'm sure many of yours, were being married off when they were as young as 10 or 11 or 15. And in effect, they were treated as property. They didn't have the right to go outside the home or go out and work. We are literally only 150 years away from being property ourselves. That's a really small span of time in which to claim independence. I think, of course, every decade, you know, we become freer and freer. And when you ask me which city I love, Delhi, the history of it is so close to my heart. And Delhi is also where I became a journalist and a young writer. So that part of my heart is with Delhi. But somehow, you know, when I think of it from a gender lens, Calcutta, the women out here, from the Navatinka Debsen, who recently passed away, to Mahashweta Devi, to, you know, anyone you can think of. I mean, the woman in Jogu Bazaar selling shobjis. The women taught me actually how to not just be a feisty woman, but how to somehow find your own ground. I think despite the problems that they face, the women in Calcutta are extraordinary. No offense to the men, you're also really nice, but I have to say the women are streets ahead of you. So yeah.
And Nilanjana, you made us all very happy. Thank you very much for that. And we do have one question. So I'm going to read that out to you before we get back to what are you working on now? What do we have to look forward to? We'll end with that. But if we have a few more questions, I'd like to take. Recently, it's anonymous, so I won't be able to introduce the person to you. Recently read one of your tweets where you were reminiscing about your early journalist days, talking about the first interview you ever conducted. Who was the first person you interviewed? Tell us more about your experience that day and any tips for journalism students.
Okay, I'm not going to talk about the first, but I'm going to talk about some of the most interesting.
Okay, let's do it. Yeah.
I was lucky enough to interview Vikram Seth fairly early on, and Arundhati at a slightly later stage. A lot of the young artists like K.S. Radhakrishnan on one hand, Nandini Malani on the other, a lot of the ceramic artists.
Yeah.
And I think they were so kind because I didn't know much about either journalism or the art of interviewing. And I would go in looking very serious with my tape recorder and pen and pencil. And then I would, you know, bug them with questions for about 1 hour, then go back, read my notes and say, oh my God, I didn't cover this. Mm-hmm. And then go back and take another 2 hours of their time and then get back home and say, I missed out on that. And I was persistent, I'll give myself that. But I think what those years really taught me, what journalism has taught me to do, is to get out of my own head and to understand that other people's stories are never simple. we are under so much pressure to summarize people's lives or viewpoints in one soundbite, or one meme, or a tiny paragraph or something. And actually, people have lived lives, and you must find a way to respect that. You must find a way to respect that they come with an entire world attached. What advice I give journalism students is actually read as much in the way of good classic journalism from all around the world. Don't just stick with our world, or don't just stick with the US and UK Pulitzer or award-winning circuit. Look at the Arab world, look at the Turkish world, look at Africa, and just find the best journalists. Know what your own past is, Find your reading and documentary and photojournalistic past and understand where your ancestors came from. That's much more important than anyone can tell you how to go out in the field and the tips and tricks and all of that. And I know we're short on time, so I'll just say that at this point, I'm really happy that the interview is happening today, because I just finished the final edits on book 1 of the Black River series. I took a long time writing these books because what I thought was one book was actually 2. It was twins and not a soloist. And this is, I don't want to say too much about it, but it's a very different set of books from The Wildings. It's something like a literary thriller, and it's set slightly outside of Delhi. One part of it is in a village on the outskirts of Faridabad, and one part of it is in the very, very fancy bungalows of places like Chhatarpur, where you have the farmhouse circuit. I apologize in advance because it is very bloody. It does have murders in it, and it does have gore, and I find that it's almost as calming as meditation, actually, to write a good murder. It's
Really?
very peaceful.
Wow.
Yeah.
So my question now to you is, as a feminist, as a person who has lived in all these 4 cities, where do you think in India, I'm coming back to your gender equality question and the fact that you have said that we sometimes tend to forget that there is a battle that needs to be fought and it needs to keep going on. So where do you think, I mean, this is, I know, a very, very standard question or standard statement, that in this entire thing, where does the woman fault and where does the man fault?
Okay. I'm going to take that question and turn it a little bit.
Okay. Yeah.
And say, all right, what do we need to do to move ahead? And what I see is that we still have not just rampant inequality, but there are 2 things that are clinical. One is that India has a bump in the population. The numbers of young men are much higher. And that immediately means that we are in a state of inequality. I don't think it's as neat as the men and the women in opposition to each other. I think understanding, though, that we are living through a time of an intensely masculine culture, and not a positive model of masculinity either. It is an unquestioning, unthinking, patriarchal, traditional, but the wrong traditions of masculinity, which just says we have the right and women should know their place. And along with women, the subtext is that people from everywhere else should know their place. If you are a minority religion, you should know your place. If you're from not the upper castes and you're not of any use to us, then you should know your place. So, I see this masculinity very much as the kind of masculinity that keeps order. And that says nobody step across their lines. Everybody stay in their lane and don't push the boat, don't rock the boat. Okay? The things, we focus on things that are not unimportant in themselves. The Me Too movement will carry feminists a certain distance forward. But when you look at the data, what I'm most worried about is that in the last 10 years, the number of women who have dropped out of the workforce in rural India, in agricultural world, those norms in labor that is blue collar, and the number of women who are now no longer migrating as much, and that's also going to be affected by the pandemic. That's one part of it. So you have something like decades worth of positive change being turned around and sat on its head, and women are staying at home more, they're less in charge of their incomes, and I think that's a really serious problem. The second one, where is it women's fault? I think just complacency and also fatigue. A lot of women feel like they have enough on their plates, managing work and balancing that against the household or the children or whatever it is that women are supposed to balance. I don't think we take enough time to figure out what we want as individuals and what we can do and should be doing for the community. And sometimes those burdens seem almost too large for us to carry. But something that I'd like to share is something that Gloria Steinem said in Calcutta. She said, maybe the task before us is to imagine equality because we don't really know what that looks like. We've not grown up in an equal world. And so none of us can bring into being a world that we haven't seen.
True, very
Does
true.
that make sense?
We do that. That's a beautiful answer, and we do have two quick questions
Sure.
before we run out of time. One is from Soumya Verma, my daughter. So I'm happy that she's listened in. And as a young activist, I fear that effective, socially relevant journalism often gets limited in its reach to people who are already interested in these issues. How do you think one can broaden the reach to create change in mindsets and norms?
That is such an excellent question because it is a problem. It is a problem where a lot of good journalism is being done in that field and then is reaching only a narrow group of already committed people. But when I look at your generation, I see the brilliance with which you can use platforms like TikTok, for example. I also see something that we don't do enough of. We don't translate enough of English journalism into Hindi or Bengali or Tamil or local languages. And when I look at Hindi newspapers, I would love them to be filled with columns that talked about these issues, for example. I would also like it to move out of a straitjacket. One of the most successful models for me was Teen Vogue. I'm sure that you know about it, but just to explain a little bit to the audience. Teen Vogue suddenly reinvented itself with a very successful online digital model some years ago, and has since then, along with fashion or along with issues that affect teenage girls, bullying at school, or how to start off understanding how to be financially independent, they do a tremendous amount of what would be considered political journalism because they really believe that all of this, understanding about the environment or understanding about how America votes or understanding about Trump or understanding about Black Lives Matter is also personally important to you. And I would say do that, why should fashion be separate from activism? Why should what you love in one field be, pushed away? Mash it up and see what you can do. Just talk to people, not in that artificial voice that we sometimes take on. We are telling you about the problem of malnutrition. No one's going to read that. But tell them the story of a person with a life that they can see, not top down, but somebody who is doing something for themselves under very difficult circumstances and they will respond. So, change the playing field. My generation did that to some extent, but not entirely. We didn't, we stayed by and large within the boundaries of old school journalism. And now I see that entire ballpark cracking up. And I think your generation and the generation below yours, the 15-year-olds, the 14-year-olds who are very politically aware, they are going to be the ones who find a completely new way to do this work. Good luck to you.
Thank you, Nilanjana. We have one more question, and we are also running out of, I'm trying to look at the time. Yeah, we have about a few minutes. Is there a paperback or hardcover version of the Wildings available?
I think it's currently out of print. Unfortunately, it just went out of print during the pandemic. But I think if The Canadian version is available, and the US version, the US edition, is still available on Amazon. If it's too high priced, just hang in there, and we will be bringing it back into print soon. It just ran through its last print run, and because of the pandemic, they haven't been able to, put in a new print run. But thank you so much for asking. And there's a Kindle version, of course.
There is, of course, which you are not very fond of, the Kindle. So we would like.
I am so an old school. I have a Kindle. It's very useful. I love taking my library on it for long trips. But in the end, look at this. Look at the paper and all of that. I love the feel of a book. I'm very old-fashioned that way.
So Nilanjana, there's so much more that I want to talk to you about. We do have, let me see if there's a few more questions. I don't want to miss out. Quickly, before we go in for the vote of thanks, tell us about Tagore's influence in your life. And I know that brings a smile to your face. So
it does, because I discovered Tagore initially in the way that we all do. There's the set of books at the back, and you're singing Tagore songs, and you're watching the dance dramas. And my first sense of him was actually through the novels, which I read, I think, like everybody, obsessively. And I read them in English, and then I read them in Bengali, and then I read them in whatever versions I could get hold of, because I loved his women. I loved the fact that he was a man of his time, and he was still writing feisty women. And he was writing men with so many shades, In Ghoribaile, for example, a lot of people see Nikhilesh as the weak man, and you don't realize that actually he has a kind of strength that's unobtrusive. Just because he's not being in your face about it, he's still a man of great conviction, and he's a very modern man in a way. But when I was researching the modern review for one of the other books, let me see that I have it here. This is selections from Ramananda Chatterjee's The Modern Review. Right. And I edited that along with some of his family members, including some of his family members. And at that time, I started to get very interested in Indian nationalism. And the Tagore I discovered in the pages of magazines like The Modern Review and Prabhashi was so different from the Tagore that we encounter in the popular imagination. The beautiful, soul-struck poet of the Gitanjali suddenly turns into this thoughtful man who's not afraid to question Gandhi on aspects of nationalism, to say that, no, I don't agree with this word, because I think while you can love India, and you can love Mother India, you can love the motherland, you can love the earth, you can love the people, he saw the dangers of nationalism and national pride much earlier on. He saw that it can become something that excludes people or puts us at the throat of other countries, saying that's the enemy. How do you define yourself through national pride if you don't have an enemy, internal or external, right? I discovered that, in a sense, the Tagore of the lectures and the letters was such a different man. I think he was really one of the first modern public intellectuals, if you want to use that term. And I often argued in my head also with Tagore. I argue a lot with the nationalists in my head. I found myself, really disagreeing with Gandhi and with Nehru on some issues, but I think they were men who invited disagreement. It was not dangerous or disallowed to have that space of disagreement with them. When you look at all of them, Tagore and the rest, what you see is that they spent so many of their lives in fierce dispute with each other. It's not that they agreed, but they did not, they did not drop their stormtroopers on each other. They did not say, you have a different opinion, so I will never speak to you again, and I will try to kill you. The Tagore who was capable of arguing not just the cause of the freedom struggle, but the cause of women's education, the cause of so much else that he believed in. For years, for decades. I wish people would discover that. I wish they would discover his essays and letters, as well as, in a way, have we not fixed Tagore on a pedestal as that bust of Gurudev? And you can't do that with any writer or any thinker you love, you have to understand that they were men and women who lived in the particular time and who went through changes and evolved over a long period. And that's the way I see Tagore. It's a very personal relationship. I don't think he would have minded.
We have one last question from Debapriya Sarkar before we end. Debapriya, can you hear me? I think we'll just unmute Debapriya, please. Or you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, Debapriya, can you unmute yourself?
No, I don't. Yeah, are you there?
No worries.
Don't worry. Yeah.
So, ma'am, my question is, since you brought up Nikhilesh, I wanted to ask you about in Chokhir the character of Binodini. There, Tagore portrayed, he drew a sort of a, a line and showed a contrast between the wife and Binodini, and showed how what education does to women, how empowered Binodini felt, even though she was oppressed in so many ways by the society. So my question is, the way, Binodini used sort of her education, the way she tried to gain what she wanted to, much to Bali's disadvantage. Was it something was Tagore trying to put the image of women in a way that they are not idealistic, or the Nari is not someone who is always self-sacrificing and good and everything. They can also be someone, he tried to portray a very humane picture of Binodini.
I think one of the reasons why I loved Robi Thakur so much is because he was a great bumper of everyone and everything off pedestals. And by that, I don't mean that he did it in a deliberately, unpleasant way. But I find that a lot of my favorite writers, whether it is Tagore, Toni Morrison, or a lot of the modern writers whom I read, have the same instinct in mind. As a writer, and I'm going to answer this from the writer's perspective, you don't want to idealize your characters, and they don't want to be idealized either. People are always going to be human and flawed, and sometimes a mixture of both. A character like Binodini might have some features of her that were kind or that were simply out to find space for herself, and some features about her that were ruthless. And it's not that Tagore was sitting there when he was writing Binodini saying, I will now cast a bad light on the name of women. I don't think he was doing that at all. I think what he did all along, and which is why we still read him, and which is why we still read some of the writers whom we love so much today and in any generation, is because they're true to life. And the truth about life is that it's messy. I see very few people who are ideal in any way or the other, or who are representatives of a type. I see a lot of people who are many things at many times, One of the characters in my book, Black River, is a father who has suffered a tremendous loss. And you feel for him. But that loss also drives him to do things that you might not agree with. And when I wrote that, I was uncomfortable with some of the choices he made. But the thing is that it was his choice, it was not mine, and I had to respect that. I hope that helps.
Nilanjana, thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure to reconnect, to chat, and I'm sure our audience is absolutely in awe of what you've been saying and how much you've achieved. May I hand over to who's taking over? Anandita?
Oh, may I just say, I thank you so much for doing this talk with such generosity. And I knew you were going to be a superb guide through all of this. And thank you for also, making the connection again. We went to the same school, and this is the first time that we are talking after some 20-25 years. So I owe the Prabha Khaitan Foundation also a reunion with an old friend.
Absolutely, but I would like to thank you on behalf of Prabha Khaitan Foundation to say that we have loved this session. We've enjoyed being with you. We hope to see you in Calcutta soon when this is all over, and do this all over again. Taj Bengal, who normally is we do all these authors afternoons at Taj Bengal. So we have to thank them, and we hope that we'll be back there. And Shree Cement Limited, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much, and we look forward. I always like to thank our back office team who just puts these placards on, Anandita and Mansi and everybody else who makes this absolutely seamless and beautiful. Thank you, and have a great weekend, rest after this, and we will catch up so that the midnight chats about the cats can continue.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It is a pleasure to be invited by women to talk to so many interesting women as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.